Martin Varela agus fáilte an darna video agam mian tabadil Gaelic. Good morning everyone and welcome to my second video about the Gaelic alphabet. As I mentioned in the last one, I'm remaking a video I did a number of years ago which wasn't really aimed at learners but turned out to be really popular. I'm adding new stuff in. I'm hopefully explaining things better. And so from one 15-minute video, it's now turning into at least a 4-parter. And last week we looked at lenition and slenderization and what are they, and this week we're going to be looking at applying those theoretical concepts to the practical side of things in actually going through all the consonants and how to pronounce them and all their different lenited and slenderized variations. Next week will be vowels, hopefully. So the first thing you'll be pleased to know is that there are only 17 letters in the Gaelic alphabet. Obviously, Gaelic uses the Latin alphabet, the same as English does, but we have a different mix of letters. Some languages that use the Latin alphabet have more, such as, Scandinavian languages often have more letters. German has /z as well. We have these 17 letters, of which there are 5 vowels, 11 consonants, and the letter H, which is more of a diacritic mark than a letter in its own right. The H is basically there to show you that you're leniting the letter, except with a few exceptions that we'll get to. So you'll recall that lenition, which is usually represented in writing by adding an H in after the consonant, is basically just letting more air get through your mouth as you're pronouncing that letter. So we'll go from B to V, from K to H, from S to H, that sort of thing. So the details coming up, but lenition is basically just letting more air through your mouth. And slenderization, which in technical terms is palatalization, but in Gaelic we use the term slender, is making things more palatalized. Now, your palate is that hard bit at the top of your mouth. You can feel it with your tongue. You do have a hard palate and a soft palate, but that's a bit of a digression. Basically, the palatalized sound is being pronounced more towards your hard palate. But perhaps an easier way for some of you to think about this is that when you're pronouncing a broad sound, usually you'll be pronouncing it with the tip of your tongue, and there'll be quite a lot of space behind your tongue, a lot of air. Whereas when you're pronouncing a slender sound, almost always you have the tip of your tongue attached to the back of your bottom teeth, and you're pronouncing it with the middle of your tongue. And this means that there's not much space in your mouth at all. And that's why we call it a slender sound, because there's only a slender space left in your mouth. But what this means is that with the combination of lenition and slenderization means that for each of those 11 consonants, there are 4 potential ways of pronouncing it. Broad and unlenited, slender and unlenited, broad and lenited, and slender and lenited. So we'll be looking at each of the letters in this sort of 4-way grid. Starting with the unlenited B, which is not the same as an English B. It has the same place of articulation. Bilabial, so you're using both lips. But once you've got your place of articulation with a plosive consonant, there are 2 more factors, which are voicing and aspiration. So what voicing means is whether or not your voice box is activated. You can find out whether you're using your voice box by putting your hand against your throat and just sort of making the sounds. B, B, or P, P. And you should be able to feel the difference there. When you're going B, there's vibration here. And when you're saying P, there isn't. And then, of course, there's aspiration, which, as we've mentioned, is how much air is coming out. And in this case, it's whether when you pronounce the sound, there is a puff of air accompanying it. And you can find this out again by using your hand, putting it in front of your mouth, and making the sound. So you can say p. You've got quite a puff of air with an English p, but with an English b, there isn't. So if you can say bin versus pin, you should be able to feel quite a difference in the amount of air coming out, and that's aspiration. So in English, a B is voiced and unaspirated, and a P is voiceless and aspirated. But in Gaelic, both a P and a B are voiceless, and the difference is the aspiration. So a Gaelic B is voiceless and unaspirated. Now we do have this sound in English. We get it when a P is following another letter. So we have pin, but spin, and the P in spin is voiceless and unaspirated, like the Gaelic B. So there you have the unlenited B in Gaelic is voiceless and unaspirated b, p. And if you're an English speaker, you might sometimes hear that as a P and sometimes hear that as a B. But that brings us along to the lenited B sound, which, as I've mentioned, when you're lenited, you have the same place of articulation, you let more sound through. So that means that technically a lenited B in Gaelic is this lovely bilabial fricative that you see before you. V, v. Now, English speakers often hear it and confuse it with V, which is labiodental. As you can see from these two pictures, it's not the same manner of articulation, but it sounds quite similar, and a lot of people do pronounce it as a V these days, or as a W. See, this is one of the things. Sometimes a lenited B will sound like a V to English ears, and sometimes it will sound like a W. And this is because it's actually neither of those things. It's this V sound, which is sort of halfway in between. And something that I almost forgot to mention, yes, there's a lot of variation in this sound from, V to V to W, and I forgot to mention, in some dialects this does get pronounced as a glottal stop. So I've mostly encountered this in people from Cape Breton. Not all the people from Cape Breton by a long stretch, but they're the ones that I've encountered who do this, will pronounce it, for example, ool as ool, which sort of cool. I like little stops. So then we get to C, which does actually have 4 different ways of being pronounced. Now, it is just pronounced k, but again, it's not the same as k in English, because of course it isn't. And the difference here is that it is pre-aspirated. Now, quite excitingly, this is a habit that Gaelic speakers picked up from the Vikings, but that's mostly irrelevant. What it means is that when you're pronouncing the sound, before you get to actually blocking off all the air in your mouth, there's a little puff of air that comes out. So it's not aka, it's achka. So aka, achka. There's this puff of air that comes out. And this is what we call phonemic difference, because there are some pre-aspiration happens with a number of the consonants, and there are some words that will mean one thing if you pre-aspirate and another if you don't. For example, we've got eke, which is pre-aspirated, it means at her, and eke, which isn't pre-aspirated, and it means at him. So you've got the pre-aspiration, and the broad C is just being pronounced the same way as you would be pronouncing the English one, except for the pre-aspiration. Then you've got the slender one, which, as I've mentioned, place the tip of your tongue on the back of your bottom teeth and make the sound with the middle of your tongue. So we've got achke and ichki. And that brings us to the lenited C, which the broad lenited C is just this lovely sound, ch, which if you can speak Scots or German or have ever pronounced the word loch correctly, you will already know how to say. So that's fairly simple. And the slender one, again, more palatalized, but it can be useful to conceptualize this sound as an angry hissing cat. So where we have loch, which is nice and choking, we then have ich, which is, as you can hear, like a cat hissing cat, and so 10 minutes in and we're only just getting to the letter D, but we have laid a lot of groundwork in concepts like voicing and aspiration, so hopefully it should go quicker from here on. But again, a D in English is voiced and unaspirated, whereas in Gaelic it's voiceless but still unaspirated. So rather than duh, it's more like duh. That's all that's to be said for the broad unlenited D, and of course the slender one, tip of your tongue behind your bottom teeth, pronounce it with the middle of your mouth, so we've got duh, duh. Now, this isn't the same sound as the English j, which you pronounce with the tip of your tongue, but it's j, j. So, don't know if you can hear the difference between j and j, but you are pronouncing it with the middle of your tongue. Broad lenited D is a bit of a wacky one, because way back about 1,000 years ago, during the Middle Irish times, it was being pronounced, as you would expect, as a dental fricative, so the that you would have in English. It isn't anymore. For some reason, we've decided to pronounce it this way, like a choking sound in the back of your throat. I do not know why this has happened. It just has. So you end up with this sound r, a r, which is voiced. So if you can pronounce the sound loch, add voicing to it. And the slender lenited D sounds pretty much like a Y in English. It is your tongue slightly closer to your palate, but it's fairly close enough to a Y in English. An F, happily enough, is pronounced just like an F in English. And a lenited F, well, if you try to let more air go through, you end up with just like a puff of air. Sometimes it's silent, but there are about 3 words that it's silent, and you'll just have to learn them. But mostly, a lenited F is just pronounced like an H in English. There aren't really any surprises with the G, although most of the sounds don't exist in English. But again, we've got a voiceless, unaspirated G, and then we've just basically got the unaspirated version of the K we had with C, so K, and again, just voicing added to the sound you have in loch, so r instead of ch. This is the same sound pretty much as the broad lenited D as well, but if you can say cat and game, k, g, and then say loch, the difference that you have between cat and game is the same as you have here from loch to Gaelic. Loch to Gaelic. And the slender lenited G is usually, again, just pronounced pretty much like a Y. From there, we skip several letters of what you might think of as the alphabet and go straight to L, which is full of surprises because English only has one phonemic variation of L, and Gaelic has 3 or 4. So this is likely to cause problems for you if you're an English speaker, just as the fact that English distinguishes L and R causes problems for speakers of Japanese. But anyway, we have the broad L, which is a great sound. Again, put the tip of your tongue on the bridge behind your teeth and put like as much air behind it as possible, and that's the sound. Or. Now, for speakers of Lachabit based dialects, of which there are many in Cape Breton, and there are also many in Cape Breton that have picked up this habit, that sound all gets sort of more back in the throat and more lip round, and it begins to sound to English speakers a lot like a W. It's not quite the same sound, but it just goes from, say, wooer to wooer. Subtle difference there. But yeah, there's some variation in how this sound is pronounced. To me, a lot of speakers don't sound very broad at all when they pronounce the sound, and of course, some speakers in Cape Breton, especially if they're second language speakers, do pronounce it very much like a W. So it's worth knowing that this variation exists. And then there's a slender L, which again you're pronouncing sort of with the middle of the tongue, so it's more of an ly sound. Yeah, yeah. So if you can imagine in English saying illuminate, which I get most English speakers don't do unless they're posh, so that was probably a bad example. But I can't think of a better example off the top of my head. So yeah, just imagine that you're pronouncing an L and a Y next to each other. Yeah. No. And then, of course, you get the lenited L, which there is no difference in writing, but it is pronounced differently. And the lenited L is pretty much just like an English L, finally. So we have Yowage, but Molowage. The sound difference is there. And that brings us to M. Obviously, your tongue is not involved with pronouncing this sound, so an M is just an M. And a lenited M, you've got the same sound as with the lenited B. It's a bilabial fricative. The only difference here is that it's more nasal. If you can't manage to pronounce it nasally, then throw your nasalization onto the next vowel. Some English varieties are more nasal than others, so if you're from Queensland or America, this should be second nature to you. If you're not, just practice sounding like them. So you have va, which isn't nasal, but morvage, which is nasal. So then we have N, and now a broad N, whether it's lenited or not, is basically the same as an English N. And a slender N, again, as with all the slender sounds, you're pronouncing it with the tip of your tongue behind the back of your bottom teeth, and you're pronouncing it with the middle of your tongue. So that's more of a ñ, which is like an ñ in Spanish, or a ny, you might think of it in English. Now there is an exception here to all of these sounds are so simple, and that's if you have a double N. If you're from some dialect groups of Cape Breton, not all of them, then that does get pronounced like an M. Again, unless you're learning that particular dialect, it's not something for you to really be concerned with, but just be aware that this does happen. Some people might say rather than renach. It happens. The P, again, is pre-aspirated. So rather than appa, it's appa. And when you lenite it, much like with the B, it doesn't become an F, which is labiodental, it becomes F, PH, which I know PH in English is pronounced the same as F, but you're pronouncing this as a voiceless bilabial fricative. So your mouth should look the same as when you're saying F, but there's just air coming through. R, again, you've got a number of different ways of pronouncing it because this is Gaelic and not English or Japanese. First off, the broad R is much like what I would think of as an English R, but I know there are so many English R's that, that's hard to say, but basically it's what we call an approximate. So it's like a sort of sound. The slender R is one of the most argued over sounds. Some people will pronounce it Z, and some people will pronounce it th. Make it slender, and if you have a native speaker around you, defer to their judgment, and then use them as your argument against the next native speaker who tells you you're pronouncing it wrong. But generally speaking, as you can tell from this diagram, you pronounce a slender R by putting your tongue in roughly the sort of place that you would pronounce a th sound. So if you can find your alveolar ridge, which is that lump behind your teeth, that's almost where your tongue should be, but like a millimeter away from that. So there's a gap. That's why it does sound a bit like a th to some people, because it's a very similar place and manner of articulation, but it's slightly different. It is more of a sh sound. And we have a double R, which is the rolled R, r. Now, I met a lot of Scots-speaking learners of Gaelic who will insist on pronouncing all their R's this way. Don't. I mean, please try not to. Learn the different sounds in Gaelic. Learn the different R sounds. Get used to pronouncing the different R sounds. And that goes for all learners, not just Scots-speaking ones, because Gaelic does genuinely have a lot of R and L sounds, more than you're used to hearing and distinguishing, no matter what variety of English or Scots you might speak as your first language. But yeah, we've got ara, idi, and ara. S is fairly simple because all of these sounds do exist in English. A broad S is just your hissing s sound. Slender S is like an SH in English. So sh, the difference between saura and shomer. And then the lenited S is just pronounced like an H. Now it is written SH. If it helps you to say, oh, well, I ignore the S, then go with that. It's just pronounced like an H. Then after that, we have T, which, as you may have come to expect by now, the T is pre-aspirated. It's also a little further forward in your mouth than an English T. When it's slenderized, you pronounce it with the middle of your tongue. It is not the same as the English sound ch, but it's somewhat similar. So that's a ch. And when you lenite it, it is pronounced like an H. And that basically brings us to the end of the consonants, because consonants like W, X, Y, and Z are myths. But we do have a trigraph, which is the CHD sound, and this is pronounced so if you can imagine coughing up a hairball, that's roughly what you're meant to sound like. But the CH is just pronounced like a broad lenited C, so h, and the D on the end, in Irish, they spell it with a T, but they do pronounce it as a dental stop. And it may be that some of the more southerly dialects of Scottish Gaelic do or did, but for most of them, we're, to make it easy to say, pronouncing it in the same place of articulation as the h, which is just like a velar stop, or a K. So that's ach, and you get this in words like shach, och, shneach, gaeltach, and so on. And that's all from the consonants. Now, I will probably realise that I've missed something out and remake the video in another 4 years, but until then, I hope this has been useful for you. We'll be back next week, either with an explanation of when to be using lenition and slenderization, or with the vowels. I haven't quite decided yet. But yes, that's that. We'll be back next week with more how to pronounce the Gaelic alphabet. And if you are interested in, learning to pronounce the alphabet through a more linguistic, physiological lens, rather than just saying, "Oh, pronounce it like this word," if you want to learn the nitty-gritty details of how to move your tongue and your teeth and your lips and so on in order to produce the sounds, then I thoroughly recommend Michael Bauer's Blas na Gaelic, which I have just stood up and collected from my bookshelf, which is why the scene shifted slightly just then. But this isn't paid promotion or anything like that. But if you are interested in learning the details of how to pronounce the sounds of Gaelic, it's a very good resource. Wasna Gaelic by Michael Bauer. Agus sinné aniu agus híime sibh Gillowain son an vlog neálathe agus híimi an a heachting sibh son bara chéan sa chuig mí an capital. Fiúraon drasta.